Well, I get asked this one, a lot. I mean, if I go to a university and lecture or read or do a workshop or something at a school, pardon me, they all want to know, how did you start writing poetry, or why did you start writing poetry? And I don't really remember a time that I didn't write poetry, but I sort of remember how it began. I liked nursery rhymes as a kid. It always fascinated me that there was so much mystery involved in them, like Hi Diddle Diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon. Well, what in the world is Hi Diddle Diddle? What's that all about? That's like, later, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rain beside the white chickens by William Carlos Williams. What in the world does so much, what is the so much depends upon? It's like Hi Diddle Diddle or Hickory Dickory Dock. It's that kind of mystery that brings you into something that seems worth considering. On top of that, my maternal grandfather, John DeBoer, who was actually my mother's stepfather, her father died when she was 12, and several years later my grandmother met John DeBoer, and they were married. John was from Holland, spoke English with a slight accent. He'd actually gotten into some trouble. He wasn't really in trouble when he was a boy living in Holland. He, as many young people did, joined the Communist Party. Later, when he discovered that it was being run by tyrants and not the kind of stuff that he'd thought it was going to be, he left it, and later immigrated to America. Well, somewhere along the McCarthy period, they discovered that he had been a member of the Communist Party, and he worked as a furniture builder and maker for a big furniture company in Tacoma. They fired him. So he set up a furniture shop in his garage at home on Sheridan Boulevard in Tacoma, and started manufacturing his own beautiful stuff. The kind of ornate stuff that it's hard to come by. A noise like that means somebody has joined my AOL. I should have turned it off before we started recording. At any rate, Grandpa John liked poetry, read poetry, wrote poetry, and published it in the Tacoma News Tribune. Very often it was political stuff, but very often it was stuff about his garden or humorous stuff or light verse. But it got me interested because, Grandpa wrote poems. I was going to write poems. And he bought me several of my earliest collections of poems. I forget the name of that guy who wrote about Alaska. But my grandfather made sure that I had a copy of that. And I can remember writing poems and showing them to him. And I just never really stopped. It was a high school teacher of mine, Pat Borgstrom, who in an English class really began to praise my work at that stage of my life, which encouraged me all the more, so that when I joined the service, I found out that a poet that I admired, John Ciardi, this is long before he had the National Public Radio show of talking about words and things, when he was just sort of beginning to become one of America's great poets, was teaching at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and I was stationed in Lincoln, so I audited a course from him, and that was one of the questions he asked the people who took the class or audited the class: why do you want to write poetry? And I told him I really couldn't stop myself. It's just something that I had always done. I don't know if I have anything important to say, I told him, but I do have, I like the way two O's bump into an L, and the way you can use words, which are just noises that we agree upon, to create mental pictures or mental ideas or actually affect human feelings. So I just continued. I didn't take myself seriously as I never at that stage I didn't even see myself publishing collections or publishing in magazines. I mean, my goodness, I'm 72 years old. The last time I Googled myself, there was 7,000 or 8,000 links to stuff that I've published. That's not all poetry. Some of it's, fiction. Some of it's religious essays, personal essays. Sometimes it's just my being quoted in somebody's sermon or somebody's talk when they use one of my poems as a kickoff point. And then I started college late. I was 27, and I took a composition course from Sue Bartels, who is now Susan Zanos, the widely published author. And she had us write a sonnet, and she swore that I plagiarized it from Yeats, and I hadn't, but since she thought so, I sent it off to the Dublin Review, Dublin magazine at the University of Dublin in Ireland, and they took it and a couple of others, which became quite a feather in my hat for that stage of the game. Because when I was in graduate school, I remember sitting in Mr. Alexander's office one day when another professor came into his room and was so excited because he had published a poem in the Dublin magazine, and it was the same edition of the magazine that I had published in. So that was kind of a fun day. By that time I was 30 or something. Anyway, then I took a course from David Dawson, a Canadian poet who encouraged me, and later Carol Hall, who had several books out, and then I transferred to Seattle University, where I was able to study with Kenneth McLean and Madeline DeFries, and then later I met people like Richard Hugo and William Stafford, and the next thing you know, I was in graduate school at the University of Washington, studying with Nelson Bentley and David Wagner and Stephen Spender and Richard Eberhardt, and oh my goodness, such a palette of poetic minds that I got to rub shoulders with. And so I guess the answer to the question is there's never been a time that I haven't written poetry. There isn't a form of it that I don't enjoy fiddling with, whether it's a villanelle or a sonnet or free verse or open verse, or I just enjoy it all. I mean, Eberhardt had us write 50 sonnets in a quarter. That's not a semester, that's a quarter. 50 sonnets. They didn't necessarily have to be wonderful poems, but they had to be perfect sonnets. I think 12 of them had to be Shakespearean, 10 of them had to be Italian, and 2 of them could be sonnets of our own design. His whole point was he wanted us to start thinking in iambic pentameter, and he was right. It was an incredible lesson to learn. So I'm 72 years old as we sit here today, and I'm still working on poems. I have probably written 6,000 of them. I've published nearly 3,000 of them. I have 9 or 10 collections of poetry out now. A couple more that I'm finishing up. There'll be one coming out from Backwaters Press here in Nebraska, which is entitled At the Edge of the Ancient Inland Sea. They're poems from the Nebraska experience, place poems, many of them, and my last collection was called Tekopachuk, the Buckley poems, which are all spun from my early life experiences living in a small mountain town, being raised there in the 30s and 40s and early 50s, what life was like, but there's a lot of my signature stuff in that collection as well. Those poems were probably written over a 40-year period and collected together in that one. So I can't remember ever having not written poetry, and I can't imagine the day that I will stop writing poetry. I own, if you look over this shoulder here, no, I guess it's that shoulder there, yeah. that shoulder there. That wall back there is, I suppose, 8 feet tall, 9 feet tall, whatever walls are, ceilings are. It's half the room from the fireplace back to the corner. It's all poetry. I used to make it a habit when I was actively involved in teaching workshops and things. I belonged to a national poetry club. Any friend who published a collection I bought. I made it a point every month to buy one collection of poems by somebody I really admired, and there's so many, or somebody I knew, and there's so many, but always buy a couple of small press books from people I'd never heard of. Bill Stafford used to tell me that, he used to infuriate me because he seldom revised poems, and I revise them even after they're published in magazines, and after they've been published in collections, I'll look at it and think, oh my God, how could I let that thing go out in the cold by itself? And hopefully I think I make it better. But Bill said that he thought that everybody had a collection of poems in them. And I really began to subscribe to that myself. Earlier, I kind of saw poets up on pedestals, and I think I wanted to be up on one of them. But later, I began to understand that it's a very, very social, popular art. Richard Eberhardt wrote the foreword for one of my collections and said that that poetry is a very social art. Comes across because so many of my poems are dedicated to people. People whose lives are a moment in their lives or something about them I've tried to capture in the language of poetry. So I guess that's about a full enough answer of that. It seems like every one of the questions you ask, I just ramble and ramble and ramble about, don't I? Old men do those things.